Grindelwald Valley, Switzerland, October 1932. While the village elders were reinforcing their rectangular chalets with extra timber and sealing every crack against the coming winter, 16-year-old Jakob Müller was building something they'd never seen before. A six-sided structure of stone and earth that rose from the mountainside like a geometric outcropping, its angles defying every convention of Alpine construction. The hexagon measured 12 feet across from wall to wall, with each of the 6 walls precisely 6 feet wide and 8 feet tall, tapering inward to form a corbelled roof that required no central support beam. The stones fit together without mortar, held by gravity and geometry, packed with earth and moss in a pattern Jacob had learned from his grandmother before tuberculosis took her 3 winters past. The boy's building a beehive for himself, Johann Schmidt said at the village meeting hall, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades as Grindelwald's master carpenter. Come January, they'll find him frozen solid in that peculiar tomb, mark my words. But Jacob had no intention of abandoning his shelter. He had spent 18 months learning from his Großmutter Elsa before she died in the spring of 1931, and she had taught him that fighting the Alpine cold with wood and fire was like bailing water from a sinking boat. You could survive, but you'd exhaust yourself in the effort. The old ways, the ways her own grandmother had learned from the Walser people who'd settled these mountains centuries before, understood something the modern Swiss had forgotten. Cold is not an enemy to defeat, but a force to redirect. Before we continue with Jakob's remarkable story, I want to know, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story of how a 16-year-old orphan built a shelter that stayed warm at minus 35 degrees Celsius without a fire, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel for more incredible stories of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Your support helps us bring you more amazing true stories like this one. Now, let's get back to Jakob's story. The happiest memory Jakob carried was from the summer of 1929, when he was 13, and Großmutter Elsa was still strong enough to climb. They'd hiked to an abandoned Walser settlement at 2,200 meters, where stone foundations poked through the alpine grass like broken teeth. Elsa had knelt beside one particular ruin, running her weathered hands over stones that fit together with barely a seam visible. "Feel this, Jacob," she'd said, guiding his palm to the cool surface. No mortar, no nails, just stone on stone, and it stood here 300 years. The Walser knew that mountains are made of stone, so they built with stone. They knew that earth holds temperature, so they packed their walls with it. They knew that angles matter, that 6 sides distribute weight better than 4, that curves shed wind better than corners. She'd taken him inside the foundation, into what remained of the floor. Even in summer, even roofless and exposed, the space felt different. Cooler than the air outside, but not cold. Protected. The modern way, Elsa continued, is to build thin walls and burn fuel. Fast to build, easy to understand. But it makes you a slave to the woodpile. You spend half your life cutting, stacking, carrying, burning. The old way takes longer to build, but once it's done, the mountain itself keeps you warm. The earth remembers summer heat and releases it slowly through winter. Stone absorbs heat during the day and radiates it at night. Geometry creates spaces where warm air cannot escape. You work hard once, then the building works for you forever. Jakob's father, Henrik, had dismissed his mother-in-law's teachings as peasant superstition. Henrik Müller worked at the railroad depot in Interlaken, wore a pressed uniform, believed in modern efficiency and German engineering. When Elsa tried to explain thermal mass and passive heating, Henrik would smile indulgently and change the subject. Then came November 1930. The influenza that swept through the valley took both of Jakob's parents within a week of each other. Henrik died on the 8th, Jakob's mother, Anna, on the 14th. Jakob, at 14, found himself in the home of his father's brother, Otto Müller, a man who measured worth in francs and saw orphaned nephews as unpaid labor. Otto owned a small hotel in Grindelwald, catering to the increasing number of tourists who came to gawk at the Eiger's north face. Jakob worked in the kitchen, hauled coal, scraped ice from walkways, and slept in an unheated storage room that barely fit a cot. Otto provided minimal food and no affection, but he did inadvertently provide an education. During the brutal winter of 1930, 1931, Jakob watched the hotel burn through mountain after mountain of coal and firewood. The thin-walled guest rooms required constant stoking. Guests complained about drafts. Pipes froze despite the expense. Otto spent a small fortune keeping wealthy Germans and British comfortable, and still they left mediocre reviews about the cold. Meanwhile, Großmutter Elsa, living alone in her tiny cottage at the village edge, used perhaps 1/10 the fuel and never seemed cold. Her walls were 2 feet thick, packed with stone and earth. Her windows were small and faced south. Her floor was dirt, covered with woven rugs. The building nestled into the hillside, half buried, looking more like a natural formation than a human dwelling. Jakob visited her every chance he got, which wasn't often. Otto begrudged him even the 2 hours on Sunday. "You're feeding him my bread, Mother Elsa," Otto complained once when he'd come looking for Jakob to muck out the hotel stable. "The boy has work to do." "The boy has learning to do," Elsa replied evenly. "What I teach him will matter longer than your stables." She died that April, lungs finally surrendering to the tuberculosis that had hollowed her for years. Jakob, at 15, felt something essential break inside himself. She'd been his only remaining connection to warmth, to knowledge that felt true rather than transactional. The next winter, 1931-1932, was merely harsh. But Otto's hotel had a bad season, fewer tourists, less money, and Otto's always thin patience evaporated entirely. He began finding fault with everything Jakob did. Meals were served too slowly, floors weren't clean enough, coal wasn't stacked properly. In March 1932, Jacob made the mistake of suggesting that the hotel would stay warmer if Otto insulated the north wall, perhaps with earth and stone, the way the old buildings were made. Otto's face had gone red. "You'll tell me how to run my business? You, who owns nothing, who'd be starving on the street without my charity? You'll give me advice? You're exactly like your grandmother, full of old woman's wisdom, too stupid to see that the world has moved on. We have engineering now, we have science, we don't need peasant tricks from people who live like animals." "She wasn't enough," Otto's shout echoed in the hotel kitchen. "I've fed you for 16 months, I've clothed you, I've put a roof over your worthless head, and this is the gratitude I receive? Criticism? Advice from a child?" The tirade continued for 20 minutes. It ended with Otto telling Jakob to be gone by morning. 16 years old, and Jakob was being cast out. "Take what's yours and nothing of mine," Otto said coldly. "And don't come begging when you're freezing in a ditch. I'll have the constable remove you if you do." What Jakob owned fit in a canvas rucksack. 2 changes of clothes, a wool blanket that had been his mother's, a knife his father had given him, and a small leather journal that had belonged to Großmutter Elsa. She'd filled 40 pages with drawings and notes, measurements, techniques, observations about sun angles and wind patterns, sketches of old walls or buildings with annotations in her careful handwriting. Jakob also took 3 things Otto wouldn't miss: a coil of rope from the storage shed, a mason's trowel with a cracked handle, and a canvas tarp that had been deemed too torn for hotel use. He walked out of Grindelwald before dawn on March 18, 1932, with no plan except to go up instead of down. Down meant the valley, towns, authorities, who would either return him to Otto or place him in some institution. Up meant the mountain, freedom, and perhaps a chance to prove that Elsa's wisdom was more than superstition. He hiked for 3 hours, taking shepherd's paths that wouldn't see use for another 2 months. At 1,800 meters, he found what he was looking for: a south-facing slope where an ancient rockfall had created a natural amphitheater. A small spring emerged from the rocks, flowing year-round. Stunted pines offered some wind protection. Most importantly, the land was too steep, too rocky, and too remote for any farmer or builder to want. It was worthless. But Jakob saw what others would miss. The south face would capture maximum sunlight, even in winter. The rocks would provide building material without hauling. The slope itself would allow him to build partially underground, letting earth surround and insulate his walls. The spring meant water without descending to the valley. The pines, though small, were dead standing, dry, offering minimal fuel for cooking without the labor of felling and seasoning green wood. He spent 2 weeks just watching, observing where snow melted first, where wind hit hardest, how the sun tracked across the slope from dawn to dusk, where water pooled and where it drained. This was the first lesson from Elsa's journal. Watch before you build. The land will teach you if you're patient enough to learn. On April 1st, 1932, Jacob began construction. The conventional approach to Alpine building was rectangular structures with wooden frames, board walls, and steep-pitched roofs to shed snow. They went up quickly, required minimal skill, and could be built with standard materials from the lumber mill. They were also thermal disasters. Boxy shapes created corner dead zones where heat escaped. Thin walls offered minimal insulation, and the constant need for ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning from heating stoves meant you were essentially trying to heat the outdoors. Jakob's approach, learned from Elsa's journal and the Walser ruins they had explored, was entirely different. He began by digging into the slope, creating a level foundation that was partially subterranean. The excavation went down 3 feet and back 4 feet into the hillside. The removed earth he kept in careful piles, sorted by composition: rocky soil, clay-rich soil, and topsoil with organic matter. Then he began laying stone, not in straight lines, but in a hexagon, because 6 equal sides create the most space with the least perimeter. Less perimeter means less surface area for heat to escape. The stones came from the rockfall, chosen carefully for how their natural shapes fit together: flat faces outward, irregular backs inward, to be filled with packed earth. He dry stacked them, no mortar, relying on gravity and friction the way the Walser had for 3 centuries. Each wall was not thin, but thick, 2 feet across. The interior face was stone. The exterior face was stone. The space between he filled with a mixture of clay-rich soil, dry grass, and moss, tamped down hard until it formed a solid, dense mass. This was the secret the modern builders had forgotten: thermal mass. Earth and stone have an enormous capacity to absorb and store heat. Once warmed, they release that heat slowly over hours and days. A thin wooden wall might insulate momentarily, but it has no memory. A 2-foot-thick earthen wall remembers yesterday's warmth and shares it with today's cold. The work was brutal. Jakob's hands blistered, healed, calloused. His back ached constantly. He lost weight, living on thin porridge made from barley he'd bought, with the few francs he'd saved from tips at Otto's hotel. But the hexagon grew. By early May, the wall stood chest high. That's when Jakob had his first visitor. Word had filtered back to Grindelwald that Henrik Müller's orphaned son was living like a hermit on the mountain, building something strange. Johann Schmidt, the master carpenter, hiked up with 2 of his apprentices, more out of curiosity than concern. They found Jakob laying the 4th course of stone, working with methodical precision. "So it's true," Schmidt said, not unkindly but with the tone of a man observing a dog walking on its hind legs. Impressive that it could be done at all, but obviously a poor substitute for the proper way. "You're building a... what is this supposed to be exactly?" "A shelter," Jakob replied, not stopping his work. He positioned a stone, tested its stability, nodded, and reached for the next. "A shelter." Schmidt walked around the emerging hexagon, his apprentices following. "With 6 sides?" "Yes, sir." "Buildings have 4 sides, boy. 4 corners, 4 walls. It's standard because it works. You can join walls at right angles. You can frame a roof. You can add rooms. 6 sides." He shook his head. "What's the point?" "More efficient," Jakob said. He straightened, wiped his hands on his trousers. 6 sides enclose more area with less perimeter than 4 sides. Less perimeter means less wall to lose heat through. And the angles, he gestured. When wind hits a corner, it creates turbulence, suction, pulls heat out through cracks. When wind hits an angle greater than 90 degrees, it deflects smoothly, less force. Schmidt's expression suggested he was listening to a child explain how the moon was made of cheese. "And I suppose your grandmother taught you this?" "Yes, sir, and the Walser before her." "Their buildings are still standing after 300 years. "The Walser were primitives, boy. We have better methods now. Milled lumber, proper nails, real insulation." "Your methods burn 10 cords of wood a winter," Jacob said quietly. "Maybe 12 in a bad year. This will burn less than 1, just for cooking. Maybe not even that." One of the apprentices laughed. "You think you can heat a building in winter without fire? What are you, a magician?" I think I can build a shelter that doesn't lose the heat it has, Jakob replied. That's different from heating. Schmidt sighed, the sound of a patient man dealing with an obstinate fool. Listen to me, Jakob. I knew your father. Henrik was a sensible man, a modern man. He'd be heartbroken to see you wasting your time on this beehive in the mountains. You're 16 years old. You could apprentice with me, learn a real trade, earn real money. In 5 years, you'd be a journeyman carpenter. In 10, you could be running jobs yourself. Instead, you're playing with rocks and dirt, building something that won't last one hard winter. With respect, Herr Schmidt, I don't believe that, Jakob said. He knelt and continued laying stone. Schmidt's face darkened. You're calling me a liar? I'm saying you're wrong, and come January I'll have the proof. You'll be dead come January, Schmidt said flatly. Or you'll come crawling back to civilization, frostbitten and humbled, begging for charity. I've seen the weather up here. I've built in these mountains for 30 years. And I'm telling you, as a man who knows, this won't work. It can't work. Buildings need heat. Heat requires fuel. That's reality, boy. That's physics. Then I must be misunderstanding physics, Jakob said. Because the walls are buildings I've slept in, the ruins, with no roofs, half collapsed. They're still warmer inside than outside. Even in winter, even abandoned. The stones remember, the earth remembers, and they share what they remember. Schmidt exchanged glances with his apprentices. Stones remembering, earth sharing. You sound like you've been alone too long already, boy. Mountain madness setting in. If you want to find out how Jakob's hexagonal shelter kept him alive through temperatures that killed livestock and froze water solid in minutes, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what this 16-year-old orphan built would shelter 16 people during the worst winter in recorded Alpine history, and change how an entire region thought about surviving the cold. Schmidt and his apprentices left, shaking their heads. Jakob watched them descend toward Grindelwald, then return to his stones. Through May and into June, the hexagon grew. When the walls reached 7 feet, Jakob began the delicate work of corbelling them inward to form the roof. This was perhaps the most crucial element, and the one that made his shelter truly different from standard construction. A conventional peaked roof uses a ridge beam or central support, with rafters angling down to the walls. This creates a large, tall interior space, good for ventilation in summer, terrible for heat retention in winter. Warm air rises and accumulates uselessly at the peak, while you freeze at floor level. The solution is to heat more, which requires more fuel, more labor, more expense. Jakob's corbelled roof, based on ancient techniques Elsa had shown him in Walser ruins and ancient beehive huts from Scotland and Ireland, solved this differently. Each course of stone projected slightly inward from the course below, perhaps 2 inches per layer. As the walls rose above 7 feet, they began to curve inward, creating a dome. The ceiling gradually lowered, the hexagon gradually narrowed. At 9 feet of height, the corbelling closed almost completely, leaving only a 2-foot diameter smoke hole at the center. The result was a shelter with an interior space roughly 10 feet across and 8 feet high at the center, tapering to 7 feet at the walls. The volume was perhaps 600 cubic feet, small but sufficient for one person to stand, move, sleep, and cook. More importantly, the small volume meant there was less air to keep warm, and the corbelled ceiling meant warm air could not stratify uselessly overhead. It pooled at shoulder height and radiated back down from the dome of stone and earth above. The smoke hole served triple duty. In winter, with a small fire, smoke would rise and escape, while the heated stones around the opening would glow warm, radiating down into the space. In summer, the hole could be covered with Jakob's canvas tarp, keeping rain out. And always, it provided minimal ventilation, enough to prevent suffocation or carbon monoxide poisoning, but not so much as to create a draft that would strip away warmth. Jakob built a simple mechanism for the smoke hole, a wooden frame that fit into the opening, covered with a canvas tarp controlled by ropes. By pulling different ropes, he could adjust how much of the hole was open or covered, fine-tuning ventilation and heat retention. The final element of the roof was perhaps the most crucial. Once the corbelling was complete, Jakob covered the entire structure with 8 inches of excavated earth, then planted it with alpine grasses and moss transplanted from nearby. Within weeks, the roof looked like part of the hillside. This green roof served multiple purposes: additional insulation, waterproofing as plant roots bound the soil together, and camouflage. The structure was nearly invisible from above or even from 50 yards away, blending into the slope as if it had always been there. By late June, the exterior was complete. Jakob turned his attention to the interior. The floor was earth, but not raw dirt. He dug down another 6 inches and created a foundation of fist-sized rocks for drainage, covered with a layer of sand, then carefully placed flat stones to create a smooth surface. The gaps between floor stones he filled with sand and clay, tamping and watering until it formed a solid, almost concrete-like surface. This floor would never be truly warm, but it would not wick heat away the way bare earth or wood might. It was thermally neutral. Against the north wall, Jakob built a sleeping platform of stone and earth, raised 18 inches above the floor. Cold air sinks. By sleeping elevated, he'd rest in the warmest zone of the space. He covered the platform with pine boughs, then layers of dried grass, then his wool blanket, a simple but effective bed. The door was a challenge. Wood was the obvious choice. But Jakob had limited access to milled lumber and no money to buy it. Instead, he constructed a doorframe of stones that narrowed to a 3-foot wide, 5-foot high opening, deliberately small to minimize heat loss when opened, and covered it with a frame made of lashed pine branches, packed with woven grass mats and canvas. Heavy, awkward, but functional. When closed and sealed with moss packed around the edges, virtually no air moved through it. In July, Jakob had his second visitor. This one was different. Father Andreas, the village priest, made the climb on a Thursday afternoon. He was perhaps 50, lean from a lifetime of mountain walking, and he arrived without judgment in his eyes. "Jakob Müller," he said, "I've been hearing about your project. May I see?" Jakob, wary of another mocking inspection, nonetheless opened the door. Father Andreas had never been unkind. The priest ducked through the low entrance and stood inside. He was silent for a long moment, turning slowly, taking in the corbelled ceiling, the thick walls, the carefully constructed floor and bed. "Remarkable," he finally said. "I've seen something like this before. In Ireland, years ago, the monks who lived on Skellig Michael built stone beehive huts called clochans. This is very similar. My grandmother showed me drawings," Jakob said, surprised and relieved to be understood. "She said the design appears in many places: Scotland, Ireland, the Alps, even in Africa, wherever people had more stone than wood, wherever winter was harsh." Father Andreas nodded. "Ancient solutions, not primitive, ancient. There's a difference." He ran his hand along the wall, feeling the dense earth between stones. "Thermal mass?" "Yes, Father. The earth stores heat during summer, releases it slowly through winter." "How thick are these walls?" 2 feet. "And how much heat will you need to maintain a livable temperature?" "I don't know yet," Jakob admitted. "But I believe very little. The mass should stabilize temperature, cool in summer, warm in winter. Perhaps I'll need a small fire on the coldest nights, but for warmth in my hands and face, not to heat the whole space." Father Andreas smiled. "That's clever. That's truly clever. Has anyone from the village been supportive?" "No, Father. Herr Schmidt said I'd freeze to death. My uncle won't speak to me. Others think I'm mad." People fear what they don't understand, and they especially fear being proven wrong about what they believe. The priest moved to the door, prepared to leave, then paused. "May I ask, Jakob, why didn't you come to the church? I would have helped. Food, shelter, perhaps even work." Jakob considered his answer carefully. "Because charity is given and can be taken away. He gestured to the stone walls. "This is mine, built by my hands. No one can take it from me or tell me I don't deserve it. I'd rather freeze in something I built than sleep warm in something given out of pity." Father Andreas studied him for a long moment. "You have your grandmother's pride. I hope you also have her wisdom." He placed a hand on Jakob's shoulder. "But know this, if the worst happens, if winter proves too harsh, the church door is always open. There's no shame in surviving." "Thank you, Father. And Jakob, I genuinely hope you prove Herr Schmidt wrong. His buildings are expensive, drafty, and he charges too much." A bit of humility would do the man good. After the priest left, Jakob felt less alone. At least one person understood. Through August and September, Jacob focused on resource gathering. He descended to Grindelwald twice a week, taking odd jobs that paid in cash or goods. He hauled loads for merchants, cleaned stables, split firewood for households. The irony wasn't lost on him. People paid him to prepare fuel they'd burn all winter, while he prepared a shelter that would need almost none. His reputation as reliable earned him steady work. He never complained, never refused a job, and never spoke about his shelter unless asked. When asked, he answered honestly but briefly. Most people changed the subject quickly, uncomfortable with the reminder of the strange boy living in a hexagon on the mountain. Jakob spent his earnings carefully. A metal pot for cooking, a tin cup, a wool shirt from the second-hand shop, 50 pounds of barley, which would last months, salt, which would last years, a fishing line and hooks for the streams, a sack of dried beans. The goal was not comfort, but survival. Every franc spent had to justify itself against the question, will this keep me alive? By October, Jacob had another concern. His journal was nearly full. Grossmutter Elsa's notes took up the first 40 pages. He'd filled another 30 with his own observations, measurements, and sketches of his shelter's construction. He bought a pencil and another small notebook. Cheap paper, that would do. On October 12, 1932, Jacob moved into his hexagon permanently. The autumn was growing cold. Snow had dusted the peaks above 3,000 meters. It was time to discover if his grandmother's wisdom would translate into survival. The first night, he lit a small fire, just enough to cook porridge. The smoke rose through the smoke hole as designed. The stones around the opening warmed. After eating, Jacob let the fire die to coals, then to nothing. He sealed the smoke hole mostly closed, leaving just a fist-sized gap for air. He lay on his sleeping platform, wrapped in his blanket and the residual warmth of the day, and waited. Outside, the temperature dropped to 4 degrees Celsius. Inside, Jacob's breath didn't fog. His hands, uncovered, stayed comfortable. The walls, having absorbed sunlight all day through their south-facing exposure, radiated that stored warmth gently into the space. He slept well. Each night for the next 2 weeks, Jakob repeated the experiment. Small fire for cooking, smoke hole sealed after, temperature measurements at dawn, midday, and dusk, recorded in his journal, outside versus inside. The pattern became clear. The interior temperature lagged behind the exterior by approximately 12 hours and dampened the extremes by 10 to 15 degrees. When outside air reached -2 Celsius at dawn, interior temperature held at +8 Celsius. When outside air warmed to 12 Celsius at midday, interior temperature rose only to 10 Celsius by evening. The thermal mass was working exactly as Elsa had promised. The earth and stone were remembering, averaging, stabilizing. November came hard. The first real snowstorm dropped 18 inches over 2 days. Jakob, worried about the smoke hole, climbed onto his roof, barely distinguishable from the hillside now, and cleared the opening. The snow on the green roof stayed in place, adding another layer of insulation. Inside, the temperature barely flickered. By mid-November, Jakob's confidence grew. He established a routine: wake at dawn, small fire to heat water for weak tea and porridge, let fire die, clear smoke hole if needed. Midday, descend to Grindelwald for work if weather permitted, or stay inside and fish nearby, streams if not. Evening, another small fire for cooking, perhaps an hour to read or write by its light. Sleep. His fuel consumption was minimal. 1 small armload of deadwood every 3 days, enough to cook 2 meals daily. Perhaps 1/20th of what a conventional heated building required. On November 28th, Jakob had his third visitor. Johann Schmidt returned, this time alone. Still alive then, Schmidt said by way of greeting. He stood outside the hexagon, studying it. Snow covered everything now. The green roof was white. The entrance was a dark oval in the hillside. How cold has it been inside? It hasn't, Jakob said. The coldest reading was 6 degrees above freezing. That was the night it reached -10 outside. Schmidt's expression shifted through disbelief, skepticism, and something that might have been curiosity. You're saying you maintain 6 degrees inside when it's -10 outside, with no fire? With fire only for cooking, perhaps an hour per day. That's... Schmidt stopped. "May I see inside?" Jakob stepped aside. Schmidt ducked through the entrance. He removed his gloves and held his bare hands out, feeling the air. He touched the walls. He looked up at the corbelled ceiling, down at the stone floor, at the bed, the cold fire pit. "It's warm," he said finally. "Not warm like a heated room, but warm like a spring cellar. Stable." "Yes," Jacob said. "That's what thermal mass does. It averages. Summer heat stored in the earth is still radiating into this space, and the mass is so great, tons of stone and earth, that it changes temperature very slowly. It would take weeks of continuous deep cold to chill these walls through." Schmidt was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Your grandmother taught you this?" "She learned it from her grandmother, who learned it from the Walser, who probably learned it from someone before them. Why doesn't everyone build like this?" Jakob had thought about this question many times. Because it takes longer. Because it requires no special materials, so there's no profit in selling them. Because it looks strange, and people distrust strange. Because we've forgotten that the goal isn't to generate heat, it's to keep the heat we have. Schmidt nodded slowly. "And in deep winter, January, February, when it's -20 for weeks?" "I don't know yet," Jacob admitted. "But I think it'll hold. The mass is too great, the insulation too thick. The cold would have to penetrate 2 feet of earth and stone. That takes time. If you're right," Schmidt trailed off. "If you're right, you've built something that makes every building I've constructed look like expensive foolishness. I've built something that works for one person in one place," Jakob said carefully. "Your buildings house families, different problems. Perhaps," Schmidt moved to the door. "But I'll be interested to see how you fare. Genuinely interested, not hoping you fail. And Jakob, if you need anything, food, fuel, ask. I was wrong to mock you." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was something. December brought cold that made November seem mild. By the 15th, temperatures in Grindelwald Valley were reaching -15 regularly. Livestock huddled in barns. Families burned through firewood at alarming rates. 2 elderly residents died, their homes found cold, their fuel supplies exhausted. Jakob's hexagon held at 8 degrees Celsius inside when it was -18 outside. He was burning slightly more fuel now, 2 small fires per day instead of 1. And occasionally he'd keep coals alive through the evening to warm his hands and face before sleep. But his total consumption was still perhaps 1 cord of wood for the entire season, most of it used for cooking rather than heating. On December 20th, Father Andreas made another visit, struggling through waist-deep snow. He brought a loaf of bread, a small wheel of cheese, and curiosity. "The village is talking about you," the priest said, accepting tea that Jakob brewed over his small fire. "Half think you're mad and lucky, half think you've discovered something important." "What do you think, Father?" "I think you're not mad, and luck doesn't keep a shelter warm through 3 weeks of hard cold." He sipped the tea. "Show me your records." Jakob handed over his journal. Father Andreas read through the temperature measurements, the observations, the calculations of fuel consumption compared to conventional buildings. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" "No, Father. Who would care? The university in Zurich might care, the architecture faculty, the engineering department." Father Andreas closed the journal carefully. "What you've done here, Jakob, it's not just a clever survival trick. It's a demonstration of principles that modern building has largely abandoned. Thermal mass, passive solar, earth sheltering, small, efficient spaces. These aren't new ideas, but we've forgotten them in our rush to build quickly and cheaply." "Will you tell them? The university?" "With your permission, I'll write to a professor I know. But, Jakob..." The priest's expression grew serious. "If this becomes known, if you become known, your life will change. There will be attention, questions, perhaps opportunities, but also complications. Are you prepared for that?" Jakob thought of his hexagon, his solitude, his simple routine. "I just wanted to not freeze, Father. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone except myself. The best discoveries are usually accidents." Father Andreas stood to leave. "Thank you for the tea. And Jakob, Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, Father." Christmas passed quietly. Jakob spent it alone, but not lonely. He'd carved a small figure from pine, a bird, wings spread, and placed it in a crack in the wall as a memorial to Großmutter Elsa. On Christmas evening, he spoke to it, told her that her teachings had worked, that he was warm and safe and grateful. The true test came in January 1933. On January 7th, a high-pressure system settled over the Alps and didn't move for 18 days. Clear skies, no wind, and cold that descended like a physical weight. By January 10th, Grindelwald recorded -28 Celsius. By January 15th, -32. By January 18th, -35 Celsius, the coldest temperature in recorded Alpine history. The valley suffered. 4 more deaths, all elderly or very young. Pipes froze and burst. Animals died in their barns despite shelter and hay. Families burned furniture when firewood ran out. The railroad stopped running. The cold made metal brittle and dangerous. Grindelwald was essentially isolated. Every household fighting its own desperate battle against cold that seemed supernatural in its intensity. On January 19th, Father Andreas made the decision to check on Jakob. The priest knew it might be a recovery mission rather than a rescue. If the hexagon had failed, if thermal mass wasn't enough against -35, Jakob would be beyond help. But Andreas had to know. The journey took 3 hours. The cold was murderous, turning breath to ice, making every exposed inch of skin scream. Andreas wrapped himself in every layer he owned and still felt the cold gnawing toward his bones. His beard became a mask of ice. His fingers went numb despite heavy gloves. He climbed the trail, now invisible under snow, more from memory than sight. Several times he considered turning back. This was foolishness. Jakob was either dead or miraculously alive, and Andreas's own death wouldn't change either outcome. But he continued. At 1,800 meters, he searched for the hexagon and nearly missed it. Only the dark entrance gave it away, a shadow against white, nearly buried in drift. No smoke rose from the smoke hole, which Andreas initially read as confirmation of death. Then the door moved. Jakob emerged, wearing his wool shirt and a canvas vest, no hat, no gloves. His face was pink with warmth. He saw Father Andreas, and his eyes widened in alarm. "Father! Inside! Quickly!" Andreas stumbled through the entrance. The door closed behind him, and for a moment, Andreas couldn't process what his body was telling him. It was warm, not heated, not burning fire warm, but genuinely, unmistakably warm. Like entering a root cellar in autumn, like stepping into a barn full of livestock, like the thermal memory of summer somehow preserved through winter's worst assault. Andreas's hands shook as he stripped off his ice-crusted gloves. His fingers thawed, painfully. He sank onto the stone floor, overwhelmed. "Father, are you injured? Frostbite?" No, I'm... "Jakob, what temperature is it in here?" Jakob consulted a thermometer hanging on the wall, a gift from Father Andreas months ago. 4 degrees. It's dropped 2 degrees in the past week. "It's dropped 2 degrees. Andreas began to laugh, the sound edged with hysteria. "It's -35 outside, -35, and in here it's 4 degrees above freezing." "The mass," Jakob said simply. "The Earth is still releasing summer heat, slowly but steadily, and the insulation is thick enough that the cold can't penetrate faster than the mass can compensate. I've been burning a bit more fuel, 3 fires per day now instead of 2, and I keep coals alive at night, but mostly for comfort, to warm my hands and face. The space itself stays above freezing." Andreas held his hands toward the small fire pit where coals glowed faintly. "I've been heating my rectory with 3 roaring fires, constantly stoked, and it barely reaches 10 degrees. I'm burning 3 cords of wood per week. 3? And you're maintaining 4 degrees with, what, a handful of sticks per day?" "Perhaps 2 handfuls," Jakob said. "But yes." "Show me your records." Jakob handed over the journal. Andreas read through January's entries. Outside temperatures plummeting. Inside temperatures dropping slowly, but never reaching freezing. Fuel consumption minimal, and largely for cooking and comfort, not survival. "This is impossible," Andreas whispered. "And yet, here we are." "It's not impossible, Father. It's just forgotten. The walls are new. My grandmother knew. The earth is a battery, and stone is a conductor. If you build with enough mass and enough insulation, the system stabilizes. It wants to find equilibrium at whatever temperature the deep earth holds, which in these mountains is around 6 or 7 degrees year-round. Winter can't reach the deep earth. Summer can't either. So the deep earth is always the same, and if you build correctly, your shelter connects to that stability. Father Andreas sat in silence, holding his still-thawing hands toward the coals. Finally he spoke. "Jakob, I need to tell people about this. The village is suffering. People are dying, and you're sitting here in 4-degree warmth, comfortable, surviving on less fuel in a month than they burn in a day. They need to learn this. They need to understand it's possible. Will they listen? After this winter, yes. They'll have to." Word spread like fire through the valley. At first, skepticism, wild tales from a priest who had suffered frostbite delusions. But Father Andreas was insistent, and eventually Johann Schmidt agreed to make the climb to verify. Schmidt arrived on January 22nd, accompanied by 2 other master builders. They entered the hexagon expecting to find some trick, some hidden stove, some explanation that would preserve their worldview. Instead, they found a 16-year-old boy in a 6-sided stone shelter, comfortable in temperatures that had killed grown adults in modern heated homes. Schmidt asked to stay the night. Jakob agreed. The 2 men slept in the small space, Jakob on his platform, Schmidt on the floor, wrapped in borrowed blankets. The temperature outside dropped to -30. Inside, it held at 4 degrees. At dawn, Schmidt examined every inch of the structure. He measured wall thickness, noted the corbelled ceiling, studied the floor construction, touched the earth-packed walls. "It's so simple," he said, sounding almost offended. "Stone, earth, geometry, nothing expensive, nothing complicated. Just mass and insulation and time. And observation," Jakob added, "watching where the sun falls, where wind strikes, how water drains. You have to build with the mountain, not against it." "How long did this take you, start to finish?" 4 months of construction, 2 months of preparation and observation before that. 6 months total." Schmidt shook his head. "I can frame and close a house in 3 weeks, but that house will burn 10 cords of wood per winter and still have freezing corners. This took 6 months and burns." "What did you say? 1 cord?" "Not even. Perhaps 3/4 of a cord, and most of that for cooking." Schmidt looked at Jakob with something approaching respect. "You've made me obsolete, boy. If this knowledge spreads, no one will want my expensive boxes on stilts." "Or," Jakob suggested carefully, "you could learn to build this way, teach others. There's no profit in the materials, but there's value in the knowledge. People would pay for expertise." Schmidt grunted. "Perhaps. Perhaps." He moved to the door. "I'm bringing others, engineers from Interlaken, architects from Zurich if I can convince them to come. And Jakob, I'm sorry for mocking you, for predicting your death. I was wrong, and that's hard to admit, but it's true. Thank you, Herr Schmidt." Over the next 2 weeks, as the cold slowly released its grip, Jakob's hexagon became a pilgrimage site. Dozens came to see the impossible shelter. Some were merely curious. Others were desperate, hoping to learn how to build their own. Jakob welcomed them all, answered questions patiently, shared his journal freely. His uncle Otto never came, but Jakob heard through others that Otto's hotel had suffered thousands of francs in damage from frozen pipes, and the business was ruined. Jakob felt no satisfaction in this, only a distant sadness for a man who'd chosen bitterness over adaptation. In February, a professor from ETH Zurich made the journey. His name was Friedrich Weber, and he taught architectural engineering. He spent 3 days measuring, photographing, interviewing Jakob, and filling notebooks with calculations. "The thermal mass coefficient here is extraordinary," Professor Weber said, more to himself than Jakob. 2 feet of dense earth-packed stone, south-facing solar gain, minimal thermal bridging, earth sheltering reducing exposure by half, and the hexagonal form minimizing perimeter-to-area ratio. It's elegant, beautifully elegant. "It's also ancient," Jakob said. "I invented nothing. I only remembered what others forgot. The best innovations are often rediscoveries." Weber closed his notebook. "Jakob, I'd like to write a paper about this shelter. With your permission, I'd like to present it to the Swiss Architecture Society. and I'd like to invite you to Zurich to speak to my students about vernacular building techniques and thermal design. Jacob, who'd never been on a train, who owned 2 shirts and 1 pair of boots, who'd built his shelter simply to survive, didn't know what to say. "I'm not a teacher, Professor. I'm just someone who listened to his grandmother." "That makes you more qualified than most teachers," Weber replied. "Will you come?" "Yes," Jakob said. "If it means this knowledge doesn't die with me, then yes." The winter of 1933 became known as the Todsfrost, the Death Frost. Official records listed 27 deaths in Grindelwald Valley, most from cold-related causes. Across Switzerland, the number reached 300, but stories also spread of the boy who'd survived in his strange hexagonal shelter, warmer in his stone dome than families in modern heated houses. And slowly, reluctantly, some began to ask questions. Could buildings be designed differently? Could we work with earth and mass instead of fighting against cold with constant fire? Could ancient techniques offer solutions that modern methods had abandoned? Jakob's life changed. He traveled to Zurich in March and gave a tentative, awkward presentation to a hall of engineering students. He showed his sketches, explained his grandmother's teachings, and demonstrated through recorded data how thermal mass stabilized temperature. The students listened. Some dismissed it as irrelevant to modern architecture. Others saw potential. Professor Weber offered Jakob a position, not as a student since Jakob lacked formal education, but as a research assistant and consultant on a project studying vernacular Alpine building techniques. The pay was modest, but regular. Jakob accepted. Over the next 5 years, Jakob helped design and build 23 structures based on his hexagons principles. Not all were hexagonal. Some clients preferred conventional shapes, but all incorporated thick thermal mass walls, earth sheltering where possible, small efficient volumes, and passive solar orientation. Some were homes, some were mountain refuges for hikers. One was a school building in a high valley that had struggled with heating costs. The school was particularly successful. Built in 1936, it maintained interior temperatures between 8 and 15 degrees year-round with minimal fuel input, compared to the old-school building, which had required constant heating and still left students shivering in cold classrooms. The project caught attention from the Swiss Federal Office of Energy, which led to more inquiries, more projects. Jakob never became famous in the conventional sense. He never wrote books or gave lectures to large audiences. He remained quiet, methodical, more comfortable with stone and earth than words and crowds. But among architects and engineers interested in sustainable building, his name became known, the Müller technique, the hexagonal thermal shelter, the orphan who'd survived the death frost. In 1938, Jakob returned to Grindelwald and built a second structure near his original hexagon, larger, designed for a family. He married that same year. Anna was the daughter of a shepherd, practical and unimpressed by Jakob's quiet fame. They had 3 children between 1939 and 1945, and all 3 grew up running across the green roof of their earth-sheltered home, playing among the hexagonal stones that had saved their father's life. Jakob's original shelter remained standing, used as a workshop and storage. He never substantially altered it. Occasionally, students or architects would ask to visit, and Jakob would guide them through, explaining the principles as Großmutter Elsa had once explained them to him. World War II came and went. Switzerland's neutrality spared it the worst, but not all hardship. Fuel was rationed. Building materials were scarce. Jakob's low-energy designs became suddenly practical rather than merely interesting. Several more structures were built, using his methods during the war years, and all proved their worth. After the war, modern architecture exploded across Europe, glass and steel and concrete, open plans and curtain walls, Le Corbusier and the international style. Jakob's earth and hexagons seemed hopelessly backward by comparison, primitive huts in an age of progress and technology. But Jakob continued building, quietly, steadily. For clients who cared more about function than fashion, about warmth than aesthetics, about working with nature rather than dominating it. In 1954, a harsh winter returned to the Alps. Not as severe as 1933, but cold enough to strain heating systems and spike fuel costs. Jakob's buildings, by then numbering over 40 across Switzerland and into Austria, performed exactly as designed. Occupants barely noticed the cold. Fuel bills stayed low. The contrast was impossible to ignore. A small but growing movement within Swiss architecture began advocating for what they called Earth-integrated design and passive thermal regulation, fancy terms for what Jakob and the Walser had always known. Jakob lived quietly until 1972. He died at 56 suddenly of a heart attack while working on a stone wall for a neighbor. Anna found him at dusk, tools still in hand, a peaceful expression on his weathered face. The funeral was attended by 300 people, architects, engineers, former clients, neighbors, students, and strangers who'd read about the boy who'd survived the death frost. His grandson, Henrik, named for Jakob's father, gave the eulogy. "My grandfather was called crazy for building a hexagon of stone when everyone else built rectangles of wood," Henrik said. "He was called foolish for trusting his grandmother's wisdom over modern expertise. He was told he'd freeze to death, that his ideas were backward, that he'd amount to nothing." Henrik paused, looking out at the crowd. But on the coldest nights in recorded history, while others burned through their wood piles and still shivered, my grandfather sat warm in his stone shelter, comfortable and safe, proving that the old ways weren't primitive, they were simply forgotten. He taught us that the best solution isn't always the newest one, that indigenous knowledge and ancient techniques survived for centuries because they worked, that listening to the mountain is wiser than fighting against it. He built 63 structures in his lifetime, simple shelters that worked with the earth instead of against it. All but 12 are still standing today, still warm, still welcoming. The families who live in them spend almost nothing on heating. They're comfortable in summer and winter, and they'll likely stand another 100 years, long after the modern buildings around them have crumbled or been torn down. So rest now, Großvater. Großmutter Elsa is waiting, and the hexagons will hold. Jakob's original shelter stands today, more than 90 years after its construction. It's been reinforced slightly, modern waterproofing on the interior, a proper wooden door instead of the canvas and branch frame, but the core structure is unchanged. Tons of stone and earth, corbelled into a dome, nestled into the mountainside. The interior temperature still hovers around 6 degrees Celsius year-round. In the deepest winter cold, it stays above freezing. In the hottest summer heat, it remains cool. The thermal mass continues doing what thermal mass does, remembering, averaging, stabilizing. It's maintained now as a small museum by the Swiss Alpine Club. Visitors can enter, read Jakob's journal, see photographs from the death frost winter, and understand how a 16-year-old orphan survived what killed dozens of adults in heated modern homes. There are 3 memorial markers on the site. One for Jakob, one for Großmutter Elsa, one for Anna, who died in 1981. Jakob's reads, "He built with stone and earth what others built with fire and wood. His way was older, quieter, and it lasted." Elsa's reads, "She remembered what others forgot. Her wisdom saved her grandson's life." Anna's reads, "She warmed what the stones could not." The winter of 1933 tested an assumption that had gone unchallenged for generations, that surviving Alpine cold required burning massive amounts of fuel to generate heat, that the only way to stay warm was to create an artificial summer inside wooden walls, constantly maintained at enormous expense of labor and resources. Jakob proved that wrong, not with theory, but with a thermometer and his own survival, and the simple fact of his comfort while others froze. The principles he used were ancient, developed by peoples across the world who lived in harsh climates with limited resources. The Walser in Switzerland, the Berbers in North Africa, the Pueblo peoples in American Southwest, the Vikings in Scandinavia, the Mongolians on the Asian steppes. All of them learned to build with thermal mass, to shelter partially underground, to create small, efficient spaces, to work with local materials. Modern science has confirmed what these cultures knew intuitively. Thermal mass, whether stone, earth, adobe, or concrete, can store enormous amounts of heat energy. A cubic meter of stone can store roughly 50 times more heat than a cubic meter of wood. And it releases that heat slowly, over days or weeks, creating stable temperatures that don't fluctuate wildly with outside conditions. Earth sheltering reduces heating and cooling loads by 40 to 70% compared to above-ground structures. Hexagonal or circular forms reduce surface area and therefore heat loss by 15 to 20% compared to rectangular forms of the same volume. Passive solar design, orienting buildings to capture winter sun, can provide 30 to 60% of heating needs without any mechanical systems. Jakob succeeded because he was willing to question conventional wisdom. He had nothing, no money, no materials, no support, but he had observation, patience, and willingness to learn from those who had solved these problems before. What Johann Schmidt and the other master builders constructed quickly and expensively fell apart within decades, requiring constant maintenance and consuming resources endlessly. What a 16-year-old orphan built slowly and carefully still stands 90 years later, requiring almost no energy input, providing shelter and comfort through its sheer existence. There's a lesson in that contrast, about extraction versus stewardship, about knowledge hoarded versus knowledge shared, about building for profit versus building for survival, about respecting indigenous wisdom versus dismissing it as primitive superstition. Jakob never became wealthy. He never sought patents or tried to monetize his techniques. He simply built and taught anyone who asked. The 63 structures he created sheltered perhaps 300 people directly over the years. But the knowledge he helped preserve and spread influenced thousands of buildings across Europe and beyond. Every earth-sheltered home, every passive house, every architect who thinks about thermal mass and orientation before designing, they're all, in some small way, descendants of that hexagon on the mountainside. Most of those structures are gone now, replaced by conventional buildings, or simply abandoned as populations shifted to valleys and cities. But the knowledge survives, preserved in Professor Weber's papers, in architecture school curricula, in the Swiss Alpine Club's museum, and in the memory of families who grew up warm in strange hexagonal homes that seemed to generate heat from stone itself. So, here's the question for you. What conventional wisdom in your life has gone unchallenged? What solution are you pursuing simply because everyone else pursues it? What dismissed knowledge, from grandparents, from indigenous cultures, from ancient peoples, might hold answers that modern approaches have lost? What might happen if you looked at your challenges the way Jakob looked at Alpine survival? Not as a problem requiring expensive, resource-intensive solutions, but as an opportunity to work with natural systems instead of against them. If this story resonated, if it made you think differently about problem solving, about respecting traditional knowledge, about questioning assumptions, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, leave a comment about what spoke to you, and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things through observation, patience, and courage. Because sometimes the best shelter isn't the one that burns the most fuel, sometimes it's the one that needs almost none. Sometimes the wisest building technique isn't the newest invention. Sometimes it's the oldest solution, waiting to be remembered. And sometimes the people dismissed as backward, as primitive, as crazy. Sometimes they are the only ones who truly understand how to survive. Jakob Müller understood that. And on the coldest nights in Alpine history, while modern buildings failed and people died, despite every expensive attempt to generate heat, a 16-year-old orphan sat warm in his hexagon of stone, surrounded by tons of earth that remembered summer sun, proving that the future sometimes looks like the past, and that survival often comes from building with your own two hands and the wisdom of those who came before.